Sabbath time and the living is easy. With apologies to Cole Porter and with thanks to Kimberly and to Daniel, it's good to be home to Lawrence Park and to share leadership with colleagues here. As Stephen's sabbatical begins in earnest, I guess you're Miriam Moses' spy on this visit, Amanda. You're home, no less. Give our regards to Moses. To be in the company of the Reverend Dr. Rob Oliphant, MP for Don Valley West. I wonder if the MPP preaches too. I bet she'd be pretty good. Rob was the minister who welcomed me to St. Timothy and All Eatons, as we used to call it fondly, when he was serving there with Doug Lobb and Meg Jordan. Eric was the administrator. I was one of the student ministers. And when I joined the Zoom congregation last Sunday, so ably led by Allison, there was the Reverend Dr. Jean Honeysett, who was also a member of staff. And as you may know, she was a candidate from Lawrence Park a few years ago. Her picture is down the hall, and wonderful to have Jean again perhaps this morning. And I do want to say thank you for this beautiful stole. This is a gift from the Kempon family to each of the staff, and I'm very honored to have one too, although I'm not a staff member. They come from Ghana, and I'm simply very grateful. Well, mindful of Roberta's Jewish roots by marriage, my apologies to our Hebrew sisters and brothers when I've been so quick to equate summertime with Sabbath, which literally means to cease. So lest you hope this sermon won't cease soon enough, let's plunge in. True confessions, this sermon was first offered about 10 years ago in a drama, a chancel drama, as we used to call them, when John Suk went on sabbatical. And those of you who will remember my colleague, Mary Savage, from Guelph, she brought her hammock, and she set it up on the chancel, and she was your preacher. I was her straight man. I was the Ed McMahon of that morning. Sabbath. Thinking of John's sabbatical then, Stephen's now, and yours. Have you thought of this as your sabbatical too? Not so much from each other, but with each other. After all, we're thinking of John and family on this tender time since Irene's death, and after the remarkable gathering here before she died. Remarkable. As well as the memorial concert for Mark Toes in recent weeks. Keeping Sabbath is practically a dying art in our society, yet it is still a very important concept in the church. I imagine some of you, I certainly was, were brought up with firm guidelines on what you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath, and I'm not thinking of my aunt this morning. I am thinking of my maternal grandmother. She would not be amused that I'm leaving your midst at 12:30 to conduct a funeral on Sunday in Kitchener. She was a Presbyterian preacher's kid. She wouldn't have it. We couldn't play cards either, and she was a bit of a shark. We couldn't shop. We could go for a walk, and we could have a family dinner, and that's what we often did. So sorry, Grandma. Some things are out of our hands. Have you ever wondered why we gather on a Sabbath morning? Why is it we go to church? I suppose we're drawn for different reasons and we're looking for different things, and that's okay. Perhaps some come from habit or duty, or perhaps curiosity. Some to be renewed, some to give thanks, some of us to lay our burdens down or to enjoy the wonderful music. Sometimes we just need to sit quietly and wonder when the house guests are going to leave. What we're going to put in the garden this week. What we plan for the week ahead. Or perhaps we're looking for hope or peace or comfort or inspiration, fellowship or learning or some combination. For some, it might even be saving our lives. Our Sabbath needs are different, so let's pause just for a moment and think of what some of your own needs are for Sabbath. Barbara Brown Taylor is the brilliant Episcopalian priest who realized she needed to step away from her role as an Anglican priest and stop serving as a priest of a congregation. She took up teaching 20-year-olds to rediscover and redefine her relationship with God. And she wrote a marvelous book about it called Leaving Church. And then in that book she says, although we might use different words to describe it, most of us know what is killing us. For some, it is the deadly rush of our lives. For others, it is the inability to move. For some, it is the prison of our possessions. For others, it is being locked in roles and relationships that stifle us. When Barbara Brown was asked, including at a not too long ago session for preachers at Chalmers Church in Kingston, she said, "What is saving your life these days?" And one of the things she talked about was rediscovering Sabbath as a spiritual practice. But it is much more nuanced than I have suggested in the paraphrase from Porgy and Bess about summertime and the living is easy. Hopefully that's also true. I want to suggest that Sabbath is more about balance than ease. I think we're all trying to find balance in our lives. Everybody talks about balance like it's a holy grail, but sometimes they mean a balanced checkbook, or a balanced diet, or a balanced portfolio, or a balanced lifestyle, like we're trying to strive for the right balance in our work lives and the rest of our lives, and that's also a good thing. But interestingly, the Bible doesn't talk about balance as a virtue. It does encourage, though, more about life as a rhythm than a balance. After all, Moses and Miriam, the prophets, and even Jesus let their lives sway to a holy rhythm. As we hear about Sabbath rhythm in today's reading from Exodus, from the 10 Commandments, and I won't riff on the posting in the classrooms in the United States, I promise. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, says the 4th commandment. 6 days and you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God, the sovereign of your life. You shall not do any work, for in 6 days God made heaven and earth, the sea, and all of them, but rested on the 7th day. But we do miss the point if we think of Sabbath as only a commandment. Hello, Alabama. It is more of a gift than a rule. Sabbath time invites us to a different rhythm, a holy, creative rhythm of rest and renewal and recreation. I love spelling it with a capital C. Try that. It's not just recreation, it's recreation. This sacred thread that runs through our lives. You know, like the thread of technology that runs through our lives? Have you ever tried to turn off your tech for at least 24 hours? At least one sleep, try for 2? And then, and only then, only use your phone if the drapes are on fire, as my mom used to say. The word Shabbat, or Sabbath, comes from the Hebrew word that literally means to cease, although it's actually more universally translated as rest or a period of rest. A more literal translation would be ceasing from work. We're all invited to an understanding of Sabbath as learning to be still and know God's lively presence in all things and all people, to resist the killing rhythms of drivenness, depletion, compulsion, consumerism, and speed. Rather, try a sense of being centered like a rock, God is under our feet, grounded and connected. On this day, we shall do, not be. Think of Mary and Martha and their fuss about who had the better portion. To do rather than to be. In this case, try being rather than doing, goes the old Hebrew Sabbath prayer. And as Jesus reminds us in the gospel lesson this morning, the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. On the Sabbath, writes Rabbi Abram Heschel, we especially care for the seed of eternity that's planted in our soul. I love that image. If you're a gardener, you will too. To care for the seed of eternity that's planted in the soul. And old stern John Calvin had something to say. On the Sabbath, we cease our work so God can do God's work in us. Well, keeping the Sabbath can be a discipline and a practice that we can reclaim, we can recover, we can reinvent, but not in a rigid thou shalt not kind of thing. And by the way, as you read those 10 commandments, I invite you to always put the word if. If you do these things, you're in right relationship. So if you keep the Sabbath, that's the invitation for the spiritual and emotional health of our lives, our families, our communities. And if Sabbath is about letting humans let go of our need for control, to be still, as Psalm 46 says, to be still and know that God is God, to relax and simply be, especially in the summertime, especially as Lawrence Park Community Church gathered and scattered. All year round, I enjoy reading Broadview magazine. Back when it was known as the United Church Observer, when Mary and I first developed some of these ideas, our moderator at the time had just retired, and his name was David Giuliano, a great writer. And he liked to explore song lyrics, and he chose Van Morrison. These are the days. And David writes about joyful memories of childhood, including, and I love his list, you'll have your own, but he remembers glass jars of Kool-Aid, peanut butter sandwiches, grasshoppers, canvas life jackets. You remember those, Comishes, that you pulled over your head and then it flattened your ears? He mentioned those. He calls it cloud watching on my back and ant watching on my knees. What are your own memories of summer, David wonders. And he concludes, it's a song. Like the ancient mystics, including Meister Eckhart, they called it the via positiva, the spiritual way of joy and delight in creation, hence recreation. And David concludes, summers of the Spirit come at very unpredictable intervals, but when they come, grace strips down to its short sleeves and sandals and reveals itself in all its glory. As you will know, John Suk was a professor of preaching, and I was very excited when he was called to serve here. And so I don't get to preach here very often, but here's the thing, I slipped him a copy of the sermon. And he really related to this story, and I'm glad he did, and I do too. It comes from South America, a tribe of people that went on a very long journey through the jungle. And they forged on relentlessly, day after day, all ages. But suddenly, one day, after a number of days traveling, they stopped walking. They just stopped. They sat down, they made their camp, and they rested before going any farther. And they explained to the youngers in their midst this need for rest. And this is how they put it. So my soul can catch up with me. So my soul can catch up with me. Therein may lie part of the answer about why we come to church. A chance for our souls to catch up with us. A Sabbath time, in the words of the hymn and the psalm, to come and find the quiet center, to be still and know that God is here. Several years ago, when Dr. Gladstone retired from York Minster Park Baptist, they began a preaching series. Eric may remember this because a bunch of us went. And they invited Fred Craddock, who was a renowned teacher of preaching from the States. And he was asking the question about the yearning that makes people come to church week after week. In his droll way, Fred would say, you know, preachers shouldn't necessarily think people's attendance is a tribute to their preaching. Pardon the cheap accent, but he's a Georgian. People come to church every week because they're hungry. He kind of answered his own question. There may be a word from God today, and if God has something to say to us, we might actually have time to hear it. As Lawrence Park continues its sabbatical season, including sharing with Eglinton St. George's, with Stephen away for several months in leadership in such good hands, with the staff and the colleagues in the congregation, may it be a recreational Sabbath time for each of us. I close with a word from a wonderful Hebrew prayer about Sabbath. Let us pray. Without Sabbath, days pass and the years vanish, and we walk sightless among miracles. Lord, fill our eyes with seeing and our minds with knowing. Let there be moments when your presence, like lightning, illuminates the darkness in which we walk. Help us to see wherever we gaze that the burning bush is unconsumed, and we, clay, touched by God, will reach out for holiness and exclaim in wonder, "How full of awe is this place, and we did not even know it," as we make a joyful noise.